The old man sat quietly in the corner, scarred hands trembling as he lifted his coffee cup. A young waiter walked over, smirking. "Rough hands, old man." "Kitchen accident." Soft laughter rippled from a nearby table. But what no one knew, in just 2 hours those doors would swing open and 4 U.S. Navy officers would walk in, leaving the entire diner silent and making that young waiter regret every word. His name was George Walker, 78 years old, a retired U.S. Navy sailor. To the strangers passing by, he looked like any other old man, a little stooped at the shoulders. Thin white hair under a faded cap, a heavy coat pulled tight against the evening chill. But his hands told a story few bothered to notice. The scars on George's hands weren't the kind that came from clumsy accidents or careless mistakes. They were thick, raised, and pale against his weathered skin, the legacy of a fire so fierce it had melted steel and swallowed entire decks. Decades ago, aboard the USS Oriskany, a young George had run headfirst into that fire, pulling 12 crewmates to safety, refusing to leave until the last man was free. But that was a lifetime ago. Now George lived quietly in a modest apartment just a few blocks from the diner. No family waited at home, no children called to check in. His medals and commendations sat in a shoebox on a closet shelf untouched for years. George was never one to boast. What mattered most to him was that he had done the right thing and that his brothers in uniform had lived to tell their own stories. Almost every evening, George came to this small-town diner. He always chose the same corner booth by the window, ordered the same black coffee, and lingered over it in no rush, as if savoring not just the drink, but the simple, quiet rhythm of the world passing by. For the regular staff, George had long been part of the scenery, a fixture as steady as the old neon sign outside or the cracked leather booths inside. But recently, things had changed. A new face had arrived behind the counter. Kyle was young, restless, and quick to laugh, sometimes too quick. He saw George not as a man, but as a tired figure, someone easy to tease, easy to ignore, easy to dismiss, and he had no idea of the history sitting just feet away from him each night. The old-timers in the diner knew better. Miguel the cook had heard pieces of George's story through hushed conversations and the quiet respect of some of the older regulars. He'd noticed the way George folded his napkin, just so the way his eyes sometimes drifted to the door, as if waiting for someone long gone. The way he never raised his voice, not even when the world gave him every reason to. But Kyle saw an old man with shaky hands and a thin wallet. To him, George was just another forgettable customer, one more face in a sea of late-night orders. And in Kyle's eyes, George was an easy target. What Kyle didn't know, what none of them knew, was that this night would not pass quietly, because sometimes the past has a way of walking right through the front door. And sometimes even the quietest heroes are reminded that the world hasn't forgotten them after all. Kyle leaned against the counter, arms crossed, his grin growing wider as he watched George stir the last bit of sugar into his coffee. There was a flicker of amusement in his eyes, a boyish kind of mischief, the sort that hadn't yet learned where the line was. George folded his napkin, carefully smoothing its edges, as if this small act of order brought him a quiet comfort. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his wallet, thin faded leather edges worn soft with age. Slowly, he counted out the bills, lining them up on the check with precise fingers. Kyle sauntered over, rag in hand, pretending to wipe down the table next to George's. As he passed, his foot shifted, just slightly, brushing against George's boot. It was small, a careless nudge, but enough to jolt George's balance as he reached for his cane. "Oops," Kyle said lightly, not quite bothering to hide the smirk tugging at his mouth. "Careful there, Grandpa." George's hand gripped the edge of the table for a moment before he steadied himself. His eyes lifted to Kyle's, and for a brief second, something quiet and tired, but unmistakably firm, flickered in his gaze. He gave the faintest shake of his head, as though dismissing the boy's antics, and quietly turned back to his check. The nearby tables had fallen silent for a moment, though none of the customers spoke up. One middle-aged man gave a small shake of his head, muttering under his breath. A young woman cast an uneasy glance at her friend, but both quickly looked away. When Kyle turned back toward the counter, George placed a few carefully counted coins alongside the bill's exact change, with a small, folded dollar tip and gently pushed himself up from the booth. His cane tapped softly on the floor as he moved toward the door. His steps slow but steady. Kyle's voice floated after him, light and teasing, but sharp enough to cut. "Yeah, walk away, Grandpa." A few muffled laughs came from the corner table where the teenagers sat, though even they seemed unsure whether to join in. Outside, the night air greeted George with a soft chill. He pulled his coat a little tighter and made his way to the wooden bench just a few yards from the diner's window. The old wood creaked under his weight as he eased himself down, folding his hands over the top of his cane. For a while he simply sat, his gaze turned toward the quiet street, watching the headlights drift past like slow-moving stars. Inside, Kyle chuckled, tossing the rag over his shoulder as he recounted the moment. To a co-worker clearly pleased with himself, Miguel, watching from behind the kitchen window, wiped his hands on his apron, his jaw tight. His eyes flicked toward the old man sitting alone outside. And in that moment, Miguel's fingers reached for his phone. Because while the others might have seen just another old man at the end of his night, Miguel knew tonight wasn't meant to end like this. Miguel slipped into the kitchen, pushing through the swinging door with a quiet breath. The noise of the diner faded behind him, the soft clatter of dishes, the low hum of conversation, and Kyle's laughter fading into the background. Leaning against the counter, Miguel reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. His fingers hesitated for a moment over the screen before he found the number labeled Chief Allen. Without another thought, he tapped the call button and raised the phone to his ear. It rang only once. Miguel, a deep voice, answered on the other end. Chief Miguel said softly, his eyes glancing toward the small kitchen window, where he could just make out George's silhouette outside on the bench. It's him, he's here, sitting outside the diner right now. There was a pause, not hesitation, but the sharp intake of breath from a man who had been waiting years to hear those words. "Are you sure?" Alan's voice steadied itself, but there was something unmistakable beneath it. Urgency, a flicker of emotion carefully controlled. "I'm sure," Miguel replied. "He comes here every night, but tonight, you should come. You all should." On the other end of the line, the sound of a chair scraping back echoed faintly, followed by Alan's calm but firm voice. "Thank you, son. Tonight's the night." The call ended and Miguel lowered the phone, exhaling as he tucked it back into his pocket. For a moment he just stood there, hands pressed against the counter, eyes fixed on the quiet figure outside. Then with a steadying breath, he stepped back into the kitchen, the sounds of the diner folding back around him. But now they felt somehow smaller, less important, as if the night itself had shifted. Miles away in a small home lined with photographs of ship's sailors and folded flags, Chief James Allen stood from his desk, the phone still in his hand. A man in his 60s, Allen moved with the unmistakable precision of someone who had spent a lifetime in uniform. He set the phone down carefully, his fingers brushing over a faded black and white photo framed on his bookshelf, a photo of young sailors on the deck of the USS Oroscani, arms slung over each other's shoulders. His eyes lingered on the face in the center, a younger George Walker, smiling unaware of the decades to come. Allen turned sharply, his voice lifting across the room. "Boys, suit up. We found him." "Tonight's the night." In the next room, three men stirred from their chairs, their conversations halting as they caught the edge in Allen's voice. They were older now, faces lined with time, hair streaked with gray, but as they rose to their feet, there was a light in their movements that spoke of years in the service and the deep, unshakable loyalty that came with it. Allen moved quickly, his hands practiced as they reached for the uniform laid out on his bed. He pinned the medals carefully, smoothing the fabric with steady fingers. From a small wooden box on the dresser, he retrieved a velvet case, its hinge worn its purpose, long prepared. In his eyes there was no hesitation. Tonight wasn't about ceremony or speeches. It was about something older, something harder to name: debt, gratitude, and the quiet promise that no act of bravery should ever go unanswered. As Allen buckled the final button and turned toward the door, the convoy waited outside, engines, idling headlights cutting through the night. It was time. The night had settled deep over the little town, but inside the diner it was alive with the kind of noise only a weekend evening could bring. Every table was full, families chatting over plates of pie, teenagers leaning across booths, young couples laughing softly under the glow of the hanging lights. Plates clattered in the kitchen, the hiss of the coffee machine filled the air, and Kyle moved between tables with the restless energy of someone riding the high of a busy night. Outside, George remained on the bench, the cool night air brushing gently against his cheeks as he watched the streetlights flicker on one by one. He sat quietly, cane resting between his knees, a calm presence just beyond the glow of the diner's windows. But then a low rumble stirred at the edge of the night. It was faint at first, a subtle vibration, more than a sound. But as it grew, people inside began to notice. Conversation paused, forks hovered midair. Heads turned toward the large front window. Headlights pierced through the darkness, cutting long beams across the parking lot. Three black SUVs rolled slowly down the street engines, humming low headlights, bright and deliberate. The diners inside leaned forward in their seats, brows furrowing in curiosity. The vehicles came to a smooth, unhurried stop right outside the diner. Doors swung open with precise efficiency, and four figures stepped out. Their shoes hit the pavement in practiced rhythm, the soft sound of polished leather on asphalt. They were unmistakable four Navy officers, their dress blues, impeccable medals shining faintly under the street lamps. Inside, the diner fell completely silent. Kyle, halfway through pouring a cup of coffee, froze with the pot in midair. His grin faltered his brow, knitting as he squinted toward the window, trying to process what he was seeing. Around him, customers stared wide-eyed, phones forgotten in hands, conversations dead in their throats. The bell above the door jingled sharply as the officers stepped inside. Their presence filled the room in an instant. Every eye turned to them as they moved in the soft sound of their shoes on the diner's tile floor, the only thing breaking the silence. At the front, the lead officer, Commander James Allen, scanned the room with calm precision. His gaze swept across the booths, the tables, the counter, until it landed on Kyle, who stood pale and wide-eyed near the register. Allen's voice was clear, firm, and left no room for misunderstanding. "Where's Mr. George Walker?" Kyle opened his mouth. Nothing came out. His throat worked once, then again, before the words tumbled free in a thin, shaky whisper. He left earlier, sir." The room remained hushed, the air thick with something no one quite knew how to name. The diners watched as Allen gave the faintest nod, the corners of his mouth curving in a knowing, almost gentle smile. "Thank you," Allen said softly. And just like that, he turned to leading his officers toward the door once more, leaving behind a room full of people who suddenly understood that the quiet old man they had overlooked for years was not and had never been ordinary. Outside, under the pale glow of the streetlights, George sat quietly on the weathered bench, his cane resting across his knees, eyes softened by years in memory. He didn't notice the sound of footsteps at first, not until they drew closer, steady and deliberate, cutting through the hush of the night. When he looked up, four uniformed Navy officers stood before him, their dress blues sharp against the dark backdrop of the street. At the front, Chief James Allen stepped forward, his posture straight, his face marked by a mix of solemnity and warmth. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. George blinked, confusion flickering across his face as he slowly pushed his hands against the bench, preparing to rise. But before he could stand, Allen raised his hand in a sharp, practiced motion. All four officers snapped into a salute, their right hands lifting to their brows in flawless unison. George froze. His mouth parted, a soft, unsteady breath escaping as his scarred fingers hovered above the bench. His pale blue eyes glistened under the streetlight, the weight of the moment settling into his chest like a wave. For a long moment, the world around them held its breath. Allen took one step closer and lowered his salute. "Mr. George Walker," he said, his voice steady but warm. "I'm Chief James Allen. My father served with you on the Oriskany." George's brow furrowed gently, his voice a whisper. "Allen Thomas Allen." Allen smiled, his features softening. "Yes, sir. He always spoke of you. You saved his life." George exhaled, the years falling away from his face as the name settled into his heart. His lips trembled, his shoulders faintly shaking as he lowered his gaze to his trembling hands. Allen reached into his coat, pulling out a small navy blue velvet box. Holding it carefully in both hands, he extended it toward George. "For your bravery, for your sacrifice." "And for the lives you saved that night," Alan said quietly. "We've been waiting to thank you for 50 years." George stared at the box, his fingers hesitating in the air, before closing slowly around it. His touch was gentle, as though the metal inside might shatter if held too tightly. His throat worked once, twice, before his voice finally broke through. "I thought they forgot," George whispered, his voice hoarse. Alan shook his head, the warmth in his eyes unmistakable. "No, sir, we never forgot." Inside the diner, pressed against the windows, the crowd watched in breathless silence. Kyle stood just beyond the glass, his arms hanging limp at his sides, shame and awe warring on his young face. Miguel leaned against the doorframe, his eyes bright, a small, satisfied smile pulling at his mouth. One by one, the other officers approached George, each offering a handshake, a word of thanks, a quiet nod of respect. George met each man's gaze, his own eyes shimmering with unshed tears, his heart beating harder than it had in years. As the last officer stepped back, Alan placed a firm hand on George's shoulder. "You're not forgotten, George," he said softly. "You're never forgotten." And for the first time in a very long time, George Walker smiled. Not the quiet, weary smile of a man fading into the background, but the full, grateful smile of a man who knew at last that his sacrifice had not gone unseen. As the last of the Navy officers stepped back toward the waiting SUVs, the quiet night slowly began to exhale. The engines rumbled softly in the distance, but George remained seated on the bench, the velvet box still resting in his trembling hands, his heart still racing from the overwhelming moment that had just passed. Inside the diner, Kyle stood frozen near the door, his face pale, his hands twitching nervously at his sides. His playful smirk, so often his armor was gone, replaced now by the dawning realization of just how blind he had been. His heart pounded, his mouth felt dry, and his legs suddenly moved before his mind caught up. Without thinking, Kyle pushed through the door, the bell above jingling faintly as he hurried into the cool night air. His sneakers scraped awkwardly against the pavement as he jogged toward the bench. "Mr. Walker, sir." Kyle stumbled over his words, his breath hitching. "I'm sorry, I didn't know." "I didn't. I was just—" George lifted his gaze slowly, his pale blue eyes meeting Kyle's with a softness that caught the young man off guard. Kyle's throat tightened as he took in the old sailor's gentle, weathered face, the quiet strength in his posture, the steady calm in his eyes. For a long second, Kyle fidgeted his fingers, knotting together his head, bowing slightly in shame. "I shouldn't have," he tried again, but the words crumbled in his mouth. Then, without a trace of anger or judgment, George reached out and placed a scarred, trembling hand on Kyle's shoulder. "It's all right, son," George said softly, a kind, tired smile warming his face. "Learn from it." The simplicity of the words struck Kyle harder than any reprimand ever could. His chest tightened, his eyes stung faintly as he nodded quickly, unable to speak. He swallowed hard, the weight of guilt heavy, but somehow lighter under George's forgiving gaze. A few feet away, Miguel leaned casually against the doorway, arms crossed over his chest, watching the scene unfold with a small, knowing smile. He shook his head slightly, pushing off from the doorframe and walking over to stand beside Kyle. "Time to grow up," Brother Miguel murmured quietly, clapping Kyle once on the back. His voice was neither scolding nor sharp, just a gentle push toward something better, something fuller. Kyle let out a shaky breath and gave a small nod, eyes still on George, whose calm, steady presence seemed to radiate something larger than himself. For a few quiet moments, the three of them stood there. In the cool night, the old sailor, the young man learning his first hard lesson, and the cook who had quietly understood all along. Inside, the diner life slowly returned to its usual rhythm, but for Kyle, the night was anything but ordinary. It was the night he learned that heroes don't always walk with a swagger, and that respect is something often owed long before it's ever given. Inside the diner, the atmosphere had transformed. What had once been a noisy, restless room was now filled with a quiet sense of reverence, a stillness that felt almost sacred. Customers spoke in hushed tones, glancing toward the corner table, where George now sat surrounded by the four Navy officers. George's face was soft, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth, as he listened to the men share stories, laughter and memories, some his own, some from fathers or brothers who had once stood beside him on the deck of a burning ship. Plates were brought to the table, coffee refilled, and for the first time in years, George Walker sat not as a solitary figure in the corner, but as the honored guest at a table surrounded by family in uniform. Near the counter, Kyle stood, his elbows resting on the edge, eyes fixed on the scene across the room. His usual restless movements were gone. His arms were still, his face thoughtful. It was as though something in him had shifted, as if in the span of a single night, the boyish arrogance had softened into something humbler, something more aware. His eyes followed George's movements carefully, watching the old man's easy laughter, his quiet nods, the way the officers leaned in, as though every word George spoke was worth hearing. Miguel passed behind the counter, giving Kyle a light pat on the back. Kyle didn't speak, just gave a small reflective nod, his mind turning over everything he'd seen, everything he'd missed until now. From behind the register, Mr. Jenkins, the owner, watched as well. He cleared his throat, reached for the microphone that carried into the kitchen, and softly announced George Walker's table on the house tonight. A murmur ran through the room. A moment later, someone near the window began clapping, soft at first, but then it spread, a ripple of applause rolling through the diner. Couples at booths, teenagers near the door, even the cook stepping out from the kitchen, all joined in their hands, coming together not out of obligation, but out of gratitude, out of something unspoken that connected every heart in the room at once. George's eyes widened slightly, his smile deepening as he glanced around. He pressed one hand to his chest, shook his head gently, and lifted his coffee cup in quiet thanks. And as the applause softened and the diner settled once more into an easy hum, the narrator's voice drifted in, calm and reflective. In a world so quick to judge, some of the greatest heroes walk quietly among us. Their scars are not marks of shame, but of sacrifice. Outside, the night was still and peaceful. Inside, a man long overlooked was finally seen, and a young man behind the counter watched with the kind of gaze that said he would never see the world the same way again. As the night settled outside and the last cups of coffee were poured inside the diner, a deeper truth lingered in the air, one that speaks just as powerfully to our lives today. We live in a world that often celebrates the loudest voices, the flashiest successes, the most public wins. But this story reminds us that some of the greatest heroes walk among us quietly, without seeking attention or reward. Their scars, like George's, are not marks of weakness or failure, but of sacrifice of lives shaped by courage and selflessness. In today's fast-paced world, it's easy to overlook the elderly neighbor living alone, the veteran sitting quietly at the corner cafe, or the person who carries invisible burdens from long ago. What would change if we slowed down just a little, looked up, and honored the quiet heroes in our communities? And what about people like Kyle Young, unaware but capable of change? His journey reminds us that redemption is always possible. The question is, are we willing to learn to grow and to step up when the moment calls? We'd love to hear from you. Have you met a quiet hero in your life? Someone whose story deserves to be told? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Let's start a conversation about the everyday heroes among us. Thank you so much for listening to this story. If it touched your heart, please give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss future stories that celebrate the dignity, resilience, and wisdom of our elders. Together, let's keep honoring the people who remind us what true strength really looks like.